Similarly, we just hired a new police chief. And when we did that interview process, the top 3 candidates had a public interview that was also streamed live. And members of the public could ask any question they wanted. All 3 candidates, prior to applying for the position, were aware that they'd be a part, if they were the top, part of this interview process where the community can ask. And it's a little different than a traditional human resources interview.
So, Amie, thank you so much for joining us today. And would you start the conversation telling us a little bit about yourself and what got you into public sector?
Sure. So I'm Amie Hendrix. I have been a city manager here in Geneva for 2 years. Previously, I was a deputy county administrator, and before that, in the youth services realm as a youth services director for county government. I got into public service not exactly because I set out to get in our government and public service. I went to college for theater, first generation college student, and my parents allowed me to do what I wanted. So I went for theater, but the whole time I worked with a nonprofit back in my home. And working with the nonprofit, having a lot of state and federal funding, I made the leap kind of to the government realm after doing the nonprofit work for a few years, made it over to the youth services department, and really felt like I could make a difference in my community for the young people. Had amazing mentors who knew that I wanted to do more, see how I could make more of an impact, and that took me under their wings and helped shape this new role of looking at county administration as a deputy county administrator, as well as then making the transformation into city government, which is 2 different levels of government, still very local, but very different. And so that's how I've ended up where I am today. A lot of support from mentors, though, throughout my entire path, from going to college, being that first generation college student, to getting into government, to sticking with government and deciding to go in the more administrative route than the direct service route. And having that connection has really helped me.
So I remember you mentioned you were actually also the director of youth services at Tompkins counties before you came into this.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about, I know our conversations more around, how to bring youth into politics and how to bring youth into, local government. So what kind of programs or things that you did as a director of youth service at Tompkins County?
Yeah, so as youth services director, we were the planning entity mostly for youth programming. So not a lot of young people coming into my office, but all the people that support young people, from school district employees to counselors to after school programs, youth development, all of them were there. And then we had our youth board, which was mostly adults, with young people, because they were driving the programs and how they wanted to shape government for them, because often their voices feel a little unheard in local government. And so they would be advisory, and we'd work with the youth program administrators to ensure that we were incorporating it all. One of the things that I like about local government and why I've ended up here is because it touches on everyone's lives. You can't get out of your house in the morning without touching something that government has done. Be it the roads, be it services, food, all of those things. Somehow the government, good, bad, and different, and I'm sure there's lots of opinions on that, has touched that. And so working with young people to think about, how do we shape the world from the beginning? How do we shape their educational experiences? How do we acknowledge that different people need different things? Really was key to that. And that's actually one of the reasons I went back and got my master's when I did, was I wanted to help build young people into being the leaders that they could be, not just in the future, but today. And so that's always been a passion of mine. And even when I moved on to the administrative side, it helps me remember that I need to look at the big picture. It's not just the people that are showing up for public comment. Though I will say we had a great student presentation at my last council meeting. They came with a petition of 300 middle school signatures asking for an arcade in our downtown, and could the city please help them with a lot of passion and grace. And, their student council, their president couldn't be there. He had another obligation, but their vice president came and presented. And the energy that they brought to our council was really, it was just palpable in that meeting. So it's interesting to see how those things still get woven in, no matter what, because I get the opportunity to really represent everyone in our community.
That is phenomenal. I think the young crowd has like when they're passionate about something, they are passionate about something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I will say it's energized some of our other projects. So we have some funding from the state to help small businesses. And one of the small businesses that we're helping to develop, she has come in and said, I have this friend that has pinball machines, and I think that when I open my store, I have some additional space. Do you think that will help fit the need? And so even having that 5-minute, 3-minute presentation at council, energize some community members who are like, well, I think this is how we can solve this and we can work together. So it was really exciting to see that energy.
I think that's what it is. When you get your voice out, you never know who's listening and who's going to come out with the stuff or help that you probably would have least expected.
Right.
And that's why I'm a big proponent of like, if you have something to say, go say it, especially the younger crowd, because your needs are going to be very different. Like when I was a kid, my requirements were very different than what the kids over here. So even though we might be in the leadership position, we still want to be able to see what their needs are from their eyes.
Right. Yeah. No, it's definitely something. And having the reminder, I had looked back in my youth services realm, and I have some of my notebooks and stuff. And one of the things that I had made comment on, so I was young in that career when I took over as the director. I was in my late 20s, mid 20s. And I said, when you feel old or you don't understand it, bring someone on that does. Because that's what I was seeing, is often I was bringing voices to the table and they were getting shut down. And so how do we continue to bring those voices? And I'm sure I will have staff who will bring this back to me and say, hey, Amy, what about this idea? Because this is what you said,
Right.
which I think is important, having all those voices together.
Like talk about voices, like, your city probably has its own little programs, initiatives, and things like that. So can you touch on a little bit on those? Like what kind of programs, initiatives that you're running, like youth is one, and other things to build your community, and especially Geneva being like a smaller community,
Yeah.
their needs and initiatives might be a little bit different from something you see from LA, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a key piece, is not all city is the same.
Right.
Cities look very different. In some states, our city would probably not even be considered a city. It would be more like a town or something else, but it is a city. So we have key services, we have police, we have fire, we have public works, we have recreation. One of the components to that too, since I've come on board, is looking at economic development, because small cities, especially northeastern cities, we're old. We have older infrastructure. We have beautiful but old housing stock. So how do we start to take the energy to change that? And where do we bring in community? We just recently had an economic development strategy meeting where we filled the room with a bunch of community members to talk about economic development and what does it mean for the city. We've done some revitalization efforts in our downtown. Starting in 2016, we're seeing the end of those revitalization efforts. The town is looking really beautiful. The city is looking gorgeous. But how do we still have vacant spaces? So how do we fill those vacant spaces? And how do we do it in a way that reflects our values as well as the people that we serve? So having those community meetings, it's not difficult to have a community meeting, but then what do you do with that? So we had the community meeting, we have a consultant we're working with. He's taking all that information and giving us some low-hanging fruit, kind of those first steps, and then really digging into those first steps, because sometimes from the outside looking in, it's like, well, it'd be so easy. We need a grocery store downtown. Just call the major grocers and get a grocery store downtown. But behind the scenes, for a grocery store to fit the needs of 12,000 to 14,000 people, that's a little bit harder, because the economics behind grocery is not, you have a lot of waste, you have a lot of loss. So how do you fit that need and get the traffic in? And so it's really hearing from the community and then developing ways to implement but also show that we're listening and trying to provide feedback. So one of the things, I'll use the grocer as one of the initiatives, that's been a challenge. We have a couple wards that their access to food is not as good as the other wards. We do have different types of grocers though. So we have the Hernandez Mexican grocery store right downtown, which may not to some of my residents feel like a grocery store, but they do have fresh produce. They have all of these other things that we need to remember that that is a grocer. And for a large subsection of our community, that is the closest grocer they can get to without driving. So how do we support that store and build from there? So there's a lot of those key opportunities. And then the other piece is to offer them. Often I feel like post-pandemic, we have relied a lot more on Zoom and educational messages and public meetings via Zoom, which is great. It's expanded our communication strategy. However, a lot of times in Zoom, it's push strategy. It's just giving information and not gathering that information. Also, I'm seeing a desire to connect. So when we had this economic development meeting, we did it for the public. People could come and they came. Similarly, we just hired a new police chief. And when we did that interview process, the top 3 candidates had a public interview that was also streamed live. And members of the public could ask any question they wanted. All 3 candidates, prior to applying for the position, were aware that they'd be a part, if they were the top, part of this interview process where the community can ask. And it's a little different than a traditional human resources interview because I'm not controlling what they're asking. And so obviously we're prepared the candidates that they could redirect or step away from a question, but they're open. And then we followed that up with a community survey. We received a couple hundred responses, feedback, and people could talk about the candidates, why they liked candidates, what they thought candidates could improve upon. But it gave that two-way street and that connection, both in real time and then after the fact.
And thinking about it, it kind of makes sense because you're serving the community. Like these individuals, they got to feel, okay, this is our chief for this particular department. I want to be able to, like, do I feel, be able to talk to this person? Do I connect with them? And what the feeling do I get? And it's funny, kind of reminds me, like when I used to go interviews with different companies, I used to call this like the beer test. Like if I'm stuck at the airport with this individual, do I want to have a beer with them?
Yeah.
It's a different mindset, but kind of similar. Like, hey, do I connect with the person who's going to be in charge of saving my house someday? Right?
Yeah, no, it was huge. And I think one of the things now for our police chief candidates is really, you've now said this all publicly. So I know that people from the public are looking back to say, hey, you said you wanted to do this thing. And so it also builds in accountability for us on when we're saying something publicly, this is what it's going to look like. And absolutely things change and we can talk to people and say, okay, when I was interviewing for this position, I thought this is the direction. I now have more knowledge and I want to go in this direction, or financial constraints, whatever it is, you can talk through it. But I'm pretty sure that as people see our police chief, they're going to be asking those questions about, I saw in your interview this, or I saw in your interview that. I think also for all 3 candidates, though, I had heard from them that they'd heard from the community about things they really liked. And so it's a little different because a lot of times in your interview process, you don't get feedback. And when you have a community interview, as the applicant, you are getting community feedback, positive and negative, which is part of public service. It's sometimes the piece that, for me, sometimes I love it the most. And sometimes it's the thing that when I'm at home, I'm remembering that feedback and it's like, okay, how do I now use this to move ahead? Or sometimes you have to let it go. But that feedback piece right from the beginning of your interview is kind of key. And it was exciting to me and energizing, I think, for our community.
No, this is beautiful. Like I really like this. I think I've never heard of anything like this happening. And I think this could be great for other city leaders listening to this and maybe take inspiration from it. Like one thing I want to talk to you about is, like, as a female leader in local government, I know your path is always a little bit different. Would love to learn a little bit more about you. How do you think in the time you have been in public sector, the the ease of how women or female leaders can rise in local government? Like, hasn't gotten good, has gone bad, or is kind of the same? And what are the typical struggles that you think people face, or you personally could have faced
Mhm.
this role?
Yeah, so I will say that I think it's shifted in my career. So I started in local government in 2010. I was the director of youth services. That was a very easy role as a female because most of your youth services directors tend to be female, or at least now in the profession. I will say some of my older colleagues were not female, and some of the departments they were not. Um, but when I made the transition to deputy county administrator, it was very clear that I was entering a more male-driven profession in the county administrator, county or city manager roles. And that still tends to be the case. It also, my council is all male. So I have 9 council members, and this election cycle, they are all men.
Right.
And that that happens too with politicians as well. We've seen some changes and more progression towards more female leadership and some more diversity, but we're still we're still behind in all of those fields. I talked a lot about my mentors. I will say my mentors were men. And so that's a piece. I've learned a lot from them. And I like to think that they also learned from me because sometimes they would tell me how they would address something, or I've never had that situation before, maybe in a negotiation session or something. And I can say to them, yeah, but when you walk into a room, it's very different than when I walk into a room. And one of them, he said, I never thought about that. And then he said, wait, is your whole negotiations team female? I said, yes, they are. He goes, oh, he goes, what about their team? And in this particular negotiations, they were all male. And so even in that, where you're working with your employees, it's totally different feeling. Um, I do have more mentors now and colleagues and connections that are female, where we can talk about different strategies we can utilize in different support systems. But it is different as a female leader. For me, it was also different because of my age. Starting as a director in your 20s and then coming up through in your 30s is a little challenging. But people I think one of the things for me is I moved out of where I kind of grew up. So I started in Tompkins County, and I love Tompkins County. I have great memories of working there. But I often felt like I was the kid on the block, the newest, youngest department head for a long time. And even though I had risen to the deputy county administrator, I was that person. And so moving to a different city, working with a different council, honing some of my skills, learning from my council differently, that was key. And then changing the conversation and the norms has been another piece. It was not unusual for, if I'm in a meeting, for people to assume I'm going to take the meeting notes if it's all men,
Right.
or to ask if I could get them a beverage or something like that. It's very easy now for me to say, you're just as equally comfortable doing that. Or calling things out. I was recently in a meeting where the only other female in this group happened to be the person taking all of the meeting minutes. I serve as a member on that board, and they kept referring to her with my name. And so I kind of offhandedly said, there are 2 females in the room. I think you guys can figure out which one's which. And there was some laughter, but at the same time, it was like, oh, okay, that's a little uncomfortable for me, who's not used to that. Not me personally, but others. But sometimes it does take calling out, or at least acknowledging it, and depending on your crowd. I've been places where another situation where all men in an organization that was national, introducing to one of the national affiliates, and they missed me. And so afterwards, one of them said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." I said, "As the only female in the room, I'm used to it." And he goes, "It wasn't." Oh, maybe it was that. And so I think that my male colleagues, I give them a lot of credit because I've called out some of those things, and often they've been accepting of it. They, can laugh it off with humor, or sometimes they'll come and apologize. I've had male colleagues where I've had a particularly challenging meeting with someone, and afterwards they came up to me and said, I don't feel that person's behavior was okay. And had they done that to my sister, my wife, my mother, I would have been even worse than I was in the meeting, because they had called them out and realized that there would have been a different conversation between 2 men than 2 women. And so it still exists, and it still is a challenge. It's also a challenge. I'm fortunate in some ways because I'm a white woman, and so there are more of us than more diverse backgrounds, and so I have more people that look like me at my level, but there's not as many. And while we're making some growth, there's still more to be done.
Yeah, no, I think those things it's a gradual increase. And I think one of the things you mentioned that your male colleagues like realizing it and it's still a shift. At least they're realizing it, they're acknowledging it, and the next meeting gets better. The next meeting get better. And yourself also knowing this, hey, it's okay for me to call out these things like, hey, my name is Amy, not the other person. It sounds like little things, but they are big things, right? Because a person's name is so close to them. And I think you raising that probably gave more confidence to the other individual who was in your team that, hey, okay, next time somebody calls their name to somebody else, hey, I can raise this. So I think you yourself, as you know, knowingly or unknowingly, might be empowering other individuals in your team, other females who kind of see that, okay, she is doing this. I can actually also have the power or courage to do it. And I know if Amy is sitting in the meeting, she will back me up.
Yeah, and I think that's a piece is acknowledging your power that you have. And also there are times when it's not appropriate or it hasn't happened. I remember a meeting when I was in another community and a person kept referring to all the women as girlies. And he was an older man and it wasn't going to change anything to try to update how he was doing it. And he was trying to be at one point in the meeting, he goes, I know I'm not as PC as I need to be, but I'm trying. Okay, so that's his acknowledgement. It's also a little bit of, while I'm aware, I'm not willing to change. But in that moment, and with the power dynamic, he was a senior member of one of the legislative committees. It's not going to change. And so there's some acknowledgement, there's some pushback that I can provide, and then there's people that can provide it even further. I'm not in my role to be a full activist. I'm a very balanced person. There are some full activists that serve on my commissions or committees that would go much further than I would go. And so it's figuring out what my boundaries are, what my comfort level is, and how I surround myself with people that can raise me up or help me through some of those challenging situations.
Every day I'm hearing some AI startup in local government, like they're trying to implement this and that. And I've had a couple of conversations with other city leaders and would love to get your point of view on what are your thoughts on, AI and how do you think it could implement, local government, or is you or your team using it for something, or what are the things you are like, hey, I want to see how it plays out and
Yeah.
your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I think government tends to be cautionary a lot of times. So we step into things way later than other people and other organizations, businesses, whatnot. So I do know that I have colleagues that are far more ahead and are starting to jump into the AI, and it's becoming really a hot topic on how we use it. For us, at the city of Geneva, we have not really jumped into it too much. I know that there's been some writing that has been done or better improved because of some AI work, potentially. I think one of the things, though, is the cautionary side on that. If you're using it, it still has to sound like you, or else we're all going to sound the same. And so that piece. But what I'm looking at is are there certain things that we can do better with AI technology or learn from other places? So if we're looking at our budgets or resource allocation, what are the patterns that AI can start to predict? Because it can analyze way further back than I'm able to do. And so I do look forward to being able to use it a little bit more. It also will help predict different patterns because I'm from the Northeast. How much salt do we use on the road 20 years ago is starting to shift, and I can start to calculate that. But maybe using AI, we can start to look at the weather pattern, and if there are changes, then it'll help us just become a little bit better at how we're projecting for the future. So I can see it in the resource allocation side. For me personally, where I've used it some is just my calendar, using some of the technology to figure out just basic administrative work on, this is my best performing time, or even some of the insights that I can get about, you send most of your emails during this time of day, and I can think about myself and say, okay, that is a good time of day to send emails, or, oh, that's when I send all of these awful emails because I'm just drained. And so using technology to just think about, review the workload of myself personally and others, I think can go there. One of the other places I know some of my colleagues are using it is communications, not just writing or updating things, but also thinking about how we can communicate critical information. So can we use AI? Can we set it up so that anytime there's a major event, I don't have to call my team and say, hey, get this message out, that there's automatic messaging, and how can we use those platforms? I think there's some really cool uses. I also think, and maybe I've been in government too long, I'm going to be very cautious on how I use it. And also acknowledging that I have phenomenal staff and we have a wealth of information about our people. And so when you get AI involved, sometimes I've heard the other stories where you're using AI to create a report and you feed AI the wrong column, and suddenly you have identifying information that if you were doing the report by yourself, you may not have drug into that data field. And so I think we have to create our boundaries around it. The other place that I can see us doing it is really thinking about how we do water, sewer, infrastructure, and monitoring systems. And so using some technology to really look at, are we leaking? Are we doing air quality? And I do know that we're working a little bit on air quality with an outside organization, which will use some of this technology. So I think there's a lot of really interesting and exciting uses, but cautionary uses as well, to make sure that we're double checking it, because ultimately AI is being developed by humans, and we are not perfect beings. And so my thought is, neither is the AI that's being developed. I mean, eventually it'll replicate and be better, but for now, let's step into it, acknowledge it's here, and then figure out how we can really build. For young women or that want to get involved and find those places to change, I encourage them to talk to people, to think beyond their school system. We've had studies that show a lot of young people don't realize what's outside of the school system because they read what's in the school system and you identify with what you see. So you're seeing teachers, you're seeing doctors, nurses, but who's in your community? And local government has a lot of really odd jobs that you just don't know exist. You don't know, I have chemists on staff, I have highway workers, I have people that are thinking about food security, I have people planning for concerts and events, and there's just so many things that we touch on people's lives. And so for people that can't really figure out where they want to go, there's probably a local government career somewhere for you. And there's a lot of great networks to get into. I'm on the board, I mentioned before we started this, of the Engaging Local Government Leaders, ELGL. I'm just leaving that board, but that was a great start for me. Very minimal membership fee. And you get to learn about all these different careers, and it is a place for everyone. So I think those kinds of things, finding those opportunities, every government position pretty much has some kind of affiliation group. So if you like finance, there's GFOA, and you can learn more about government finance, or city management, county management, ICMA. There's, and I'm not going to name all of the alphabet soup, but there's an alphabet soup for everyone to learn more. And so definitely take that chance and also participate. Most of our council meetings, things like that, are now streamed live on YouTube or wherever for all of your local government. Ultimately, it's touching your life. So at least listen and figure out what's going on, because at the local level, you're seeing the most impact. We're going into presidential elections and all of that, and that's going to impact lives. But who decides what roads get speed bumps on, how clean your water is, what your school district looks like? That's all decided at the local level. So get involved there.
Yeah.